It is November 18th, 2025. And as we're looking at U.S. foreign policy right now, there are a lot of questions about what the U.S. is going to do, what they're going to do when it comes to Venezuela, as we have this major military buildup in the Caribbean, what they're going to do when it comes to Russia, as you have Trump wanting to get out of the war in Ukraine, but still having to deal with this ongoing NATO proxy war against Russia, and also what they're going to do when it comes to China, the rise of China, and what that means for the overall geopolitical stage. So, in order to discuss all of that, we had on a very special guest earlier who is an expert in the field. That is an understatement. So, without further ado, let's take a listen to our conversation now. Joining me now to discuss is John Mearsheimer, an author, international relations expert, and professor at the University of Chicago. Professor Mearsheimer, thanks so much for taking the time to join me.
My pleasure, Rachel. I'm glad to be here.
Well, it's an honor to have you on the show. Now, I want to get your take on the latest here, and I want to start off with this U.S. military buildup surrounding Venezuela. You've got the USS Gerald R. Ford that has arrived in the Caribbean. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has declared that Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro is the leader of an alleged drug cartel, which the State Department intends to designate as a foreign terrorist organization. And when you take a step back and you look at everything that the US is involved in, right? Fighting a proxy war against Russia, continuing to arm Israel, preparing for more conflict in the Middle East, possibly targeting Iran. They also have their eye on China. Why do you think that they are going after Venezuela in the way that they are right now?
Don't forget Nigeria, uh,
Yes, yeah.
which is the latest addition to the list. My view is that the United States, since the early 1900s, has not tolerated left leaning governments in South or Central America. It's just anathema to us. And sometimes this is a real communist government, as was the case with Chile in 1973. But in many other cases, it can just be a socialist or left leaning government, like you had in Guatemala in 1954. And I think that what you have in Venezuela is a left leaning government. It all started when Chavez was elected. And now, of course, we have his successor, Maduro. And Chavez and Maduro are just anathema to the United States, I think largely on ideological grounds. I think our view is that every country in the Western Hemisphere should be subservient to the United States. It should not challenge us in any way, including ideologically. So I think we have long had our guns on Venezuela because of its left wing politics. It's hard to make the argument that it's a serious national security threat to the United States. This whole narco terrorism argument is laughable. And the idea that Venezuela has military forces that can be used against the United States, you can't make that argument. You could possibly make the case that in the future, Venezuela could be in a situation where it forms an alliance with a country like China or Russia, and that violates the Monroe Doctrine, and therefore we have to do something about Venezuela. This is, like the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the Cuban government under Fidel Castro allowed the Soviets to put missiles in Cuba. If you had a situation like that in Venezuela, which I want to be clear, you do not, then you can justify using military force against Venezuela. But that's not the case. So I think the only reason that we're interested in doing this is for ideological reasons.
Yeah, it's been so interesting to watch as the Trump administration has suddenly gone, okay, we're concerned about drug trafficking, right? We're concerned about, of course, the southern border. And then they try to tie everything together. And one thing that really stuck out to me, because I've been reading your book, The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. And in it, you mentioned the importance of land power, right? That just air and naval power aren't enough. And so when we look at what the US is kind of building up here, you've got them building up this presence in the Caribbean. Yes, they can launch airstrikes targeting military sites inside Venezuela, but that's not going to be enough to win an actual war. And given the position that the US is currently in with everything that we have going on, do you think that the US is prepared for a full on boots on the ground type war?
I personally find it hard to imagine for two reasons. One is just that it doesn't make much sense from a purely military point of view. You'd need a lot of troops. This is not Grenada or Panama. Venezuela is a huge piece of real estate, and they have substantial military forces. And if you're going to invade that country for purposes of doing regime change, you'd need a really large force. And then once you're in there, you're in there, and getting out is always very difficult. So we'd end up having many tens of thousands, maybe even 100+ thousand troops in Venezuela. And then the question you have to ask yourself is, if we did that, could we fix the problem? In other words, could we put in some sort of democratically elected leader and we'd all live happily ever after in Venezuela? That's not going to happen, right? So the idea of putting troops on the ground makes no sense at all. And I think that, you can talk about maybe sending in special forces teams that can decapitate the regime, or using air power or naval power to coerce Venezuela. But when you look carefully at these options, they don't spell success either. First of all, Maduro is going to be very hard to get at. He knows you're coming after him, and he's going to do everything he can to hide. But even if you get him, where does that lead? I mean, how do you right the situation in Venezuela? I mean, if you think about it, and this is always how I think about these sorts of operations, and it goes back to the fact that I was in the American military during the Vietnam War from 1965 to 1975. And one thing I learned then is that when you go into countries like Vietnam or Venezuela, you're engaging in social engineering. And social engineering is incredibly difficult to do. And militaries are not good at social engineering. Militaries are good at breaking things, killing people. They're giant killing machines. And they're filled with people who are not exactly suited to engage in social engineering, especially in places like Venezuela, where the politics are incredibly complicated. So I don't see how military force of any sort can solve this problem um, in any reasonable time frame, or maybe forever. And I have the sense that President Trump understands that. Uh, I mean, I think Trump likes to talk tough, and he'll use military force, but actually in a very selective way. Um, if you think about the war against the Houthis, right? He was very angry with what the Houthis were doing in the Red Sea. He said that the Biden administration was filled with pussycats, and those pussycats couldn't defeat um, the Houthis. But I, Donald Trump, will turn the American military loose, and we'll take care of the Houthis. Well, after about 1 month, and I mean 1 month,
Right.
he said, "We quit. These Houthis are really tough hombres, and we can't beat them." And that was the end of it. And then there's the Iran 12-day war. Uh, we attacked Iran on only one day. We flew these sophisticated bombers over a handful of targets, dropped big bombs on those targets, and it lasted one day. It was June 22nd of this year. But we have done nothing since. Uh, so you can't really say that he started a war against Iran or he started a war against the Houthis. He just, launched one attack on Iran, and he fought with the Houthis for 1 month and then walked away and basically accepted the fact that the Houthis won. So, given that, the question is, what do you think he's going to do in Venezuela? Do you think he's going to launch ground forces into Venezuela? Especially since the MAGA base is adamantly opposed to this. I think that's hard to imagine. And then you get down to the question of whether he'd try to use air power or naval power. And as you say, I argue in my book that, land power is usually the way you have to go when you go to war against a country. And I think that's true here. I think, we got rid of Saddam Hussein. How did we do it? We had to invade Iraq. And then we had to search around the country, find the guy, and kill him, and then do social engineering. Do you want to do that in Venezuela? I don't think so. And I don't think Trump wants to do it. It's not what his base wants to do. So all of this is a long way of saying I find it hard to believe that he's going to do anything substantial from a military point of view against Venezuela. I wouldn't be surprised if he tried to work out a deal with Maduro. Uh, because just a pinprick type attack is not going to buy him very much, and people will point that out to him, and therefore it just makes more sense to back off, cut a deal. But that causes all sorts of problems because he's talked like Mr. Tough Guy, and here's Mr. Tough Guy now cutting a deal with somebody who's supposed to be a narco terrorist and one of the greatest threats to stability we've ever seen in the Western Hemisphere, and so forth and so on. So you're going to cut a deal with him? But anyway, that's, I think, where we are.
Yeah, and it's interesting to kind of see the way that Trump operates because exactly as you're saying, right? A month ago, he's saying, oh, the time for talking is over. And then this week he comes out and he goes, oh, we may have discussions with Maduro. And you have to kind of look at it on any given day. And then I think you're right, too. You also have to look at what he's done up until this point. Now, I want to switch gears a little bit and get into a conflict that Trump has had a hard time getting out of, although he's tried to make it look like the US is less and less involved, which that is, of course, this ongoing proxy war against Russia. You've got Zelensky signing deals to get US LNG from Greece, signing a deal for French fighter jets. But when you look at the NATO alliance, they seem to be ignoring the situation on the battlefield where Russia is not only gaining territory, but they are also actively wearing down Ukrainian defensive lines in this ongoing war of attrition. So, how do you see this war and its significance on the geopolitical stage?
Well, I think that the Russians are winning. I think that the Ukrainians are in desperate straits. You would never understand this just from reading the Western media and listening to pundits in the West talk about the situation on the battlefield. According to them, the Russians are suffering enormous casualties, making hardly any progress at all. The Ukrainians are hanging in there, and with a little bit more aid from the West, they can at least stem the tide and maybe even turn the tide. In my opinion, this bears little resemblance to reality. As you well know, this is a war of attrition. And in a war of attrition, where each side is trying to bleed the other white, what really matters is the balance of manpower, the balance of soldiers on the battlefield, up on the front lines, number one. And number two, the balance of firepower. And when you talk about firepower at this point in time, you're talking about three sets of systems. One is artillery, which has been around for a long time. Two are drones, which are a relatively recent development. And then three of these smart bombs or glide bombs that can be put in the pickle barrel. Uh, and just to sort of look at those two balances, the balance of soldiers and then the balance of firepower, uh, they both decisively favor the Russians. General Syrskyi, who is the head of the Ukrainian forces, says that the Russians outnumber the Ukrainians 3-1 overall. And at a number of critical points on the battlefield, the Ukrainians are outnumbered 6-1. And Zelensky recently said that in Pokrovsk, this city where a big battle has been taking place for a long time now, the Russians outnumber the Ukrainians 8-1. Now that's Zelensky speaking, not me. So I think in terms of manpower, when you just look at the raw numbers, the Russians are in the driver's seat. And then there's the whole question of desertions. There have been a whole spate of articles that have come out in the West talking about the desertion problem in the Ukrainian military. And in the month of October, 20,000 Ukrainians deserted from their frontline positions. And there are a number of assessments that say that over the course of this year, the calendar year 2025, there'll be, roughly 100,000 desertions. This is truly a truly staggering number when you think about the overall size of the fighting forces of the Ukrainians up on the front lines, which at the most are around 350, 400,000 at the most. And then you lose 100,000 people over the course of 2025, and you're outnumbered to begin with. Oh my, you're in deep trouble. And then there's the balance of firepower. Uh, with regard to artillery, throughout the war, people have said that the Russians have an advantage of anywhere from 5-1, 7-1, 10-1. But the Russians have really been dominant when it comes to the balance of artillery. With regard to glide bombs, these bombs that are dropped from airplanes that they put sophisticated targeting devices on so they can put them in the pickle barrel, uh, the Russians have an enormous inventory of these smart glide bombs, and the Ukrainians have none. Uh, then there's drones. At first, the Ukrainians had an advantage in drones. There's no question about that. They were doing really terrific things on the battlefield from their own point of view with drones. But almost everybody agrees that that balance has been reversed. And it's now the Russians who have a great advantage in terms of drone warfare. This is not to deny that Ukrainian drones matter on the battlefield and that Ukrainian drones are causing the Russians problems. But Russian drones are causing the Ukrainians even bigger problems. And when you marry that to the fact that the Russians have an advantage in glide bombs, a complete advantage there, and a decisive advantage in artillery, you can just see how much trouble Ukraine is in. And then just to elevate a bit to the geopolitical level and sort of get at what you started with, Trump is backing off from supporting Ukraine. This cannot be emphasized enough. Trump wants to wash his hands of that conflict. And what he's done is he has said, we, the United States, will not directly supply any more weapons to Ukraine. The Europeans can do that. We're shifting the responsibility of supporting Ukraine from the United States plus Europe to just Europe. So you can buy weapons. You Europeans can buy weapons from us and give them to the Ukrainians, but we're not going to sell them to the Ukrainians or actually give them to the Ukrainians. We're done paying for weaponry for Ukraine. You can handle it, Europe. But the problem is that Europe doesn't have the money to support Ukraine. So now they're talking about stealing Russian assets because, as you know, there are all those frozen assets in Euroclear. I think that's the name of it, this Belgium holding pen. And what the Europeans want to do is go in and steal that Russian money. But there are a lot of European actors who are not in favor of doing that. So it's not clear that the Europeans can financially support Ukraine moving forward. All of this is to say that Ukraine is in a disastrous situation, and it's reflected on what's happening on the battlefield.
Yeah, and watch this happen over just the course of the last few years, exactly as you're noting there, right? You see those numbers, you see the stats, and then you see the impact of them. And I thought it was interesting because as you've kind of watched the position that Russia is in, obviously they have been more isolated from the Western world because NATO has come in and made them the most sanctioned nation in the world. But because of that, they've really turned to China, right? They've turned to what kind of relationships they can have with other great powers, and China is a big one. So I'm curious how you see Russia's status as a great power now, and what are your concerns about how the US could try to lash out if the government that it did help build in Kiev falls apart, especially as we are looking at this war of attrition?
Yeah, there are two questions there. First question is, how do I think about Russia as a great power? I've long argued that of the three great powers in the world, the United States is clearly the most powerful. Uh, but the Chinese are a peer competitor. They're catching up to us, and there is a real danger that they will surpass us. The Chinese are truly impressive. They have so many people, roughly four times the population of the United States, and they're fantastic capitalists. I mean, I wish they were communists again. They're fantastic capitalists, and they're giving us a run for our money when it comes to developing cutting edge technologies. So they're a formidable foe. And most importantly, in my mind, they might possibly dominate Asia the way we dominate the Western Hemisphere at some point. They may end up being a regional hegemon. This just shows you what a threat they are to us. The Russians are not a serious threat to us. The Russians are the weakest of the three great powers, and there's no chance that Russia is going to dominate Europe. As you know well, Rachel, there's all this talk that Russia is going to conquer all of Ukraine. Then it's going to conquer territory in Eastern Europe, the Baltic states, parts of Poland, parts of Romania, and try to reestablish the Soviet Empire in Eastern Europe. And this is what we have to fear. This is the second coming of the Soviet Union. The Russian army is the Wehrmacht. You know all these arguments. This is just, it's poppycock. I mean, I don't know what these people are talking about. Haven't they noticed that the Russians have spent almost the past 4 years just trying to grind out territory, uh, uh, just trying to conquer territory in a grinding way in the eastern one-fifth of Ukraine? Furthermore, Putin has never expressed any interest in conquering all of Ukraine. I cannot emphasize that enough. He has never expressed any interest in conquering all of Ukraine because he surely understands that would be a formula for disaster. And he certainly has never said anything about conquering territory in Eastern Europe. So I think that there is no serious Russian threat, certainly to the United States, but to the West more generally. There's just not a threat there. But having said all that, if you believe that the balance of world power depends a lot on military might, the Russian army today is a much more formidable fighting force than it was when the war started in February of 2022. If you took any European army and you put it up against the Russian army, it would be an unfair fight. And I'll tell you, the Russian army would clobber the German army, the British army, the French army, you name it. They're no match. The United States is a different story, but we would have our hands full with the Russians. And the fact is that the size of the Russian army has grown substantially since 2022. And furthermore, it is a battle tested army that has learned. This invariably happens when armies fight wars. They start off making all sorts of mistakes and then they learn. And the reason you learn is if you don't learn, you die, and nobody wants to die. So there's a very powerful incentive to learn. And the Russians have learned. So they have a formidable army, they have a formidable military. And we're paying very care, we meaning the United States, and I'm sure it's true of the Europeans as well. We're all paying very careful attention to that Russian army, how it operates, what technologies it emphasizes, because we understand that it is a formidable fighting force. And if we ever get into a fight with it might be at a significant advantage over us because it's had this tremendous learning experience. So, my bottom line is that Russia is the weakest of the three great powers. It's not a threat to dominate Europe, much less Eastern Europe, but it is a formidable foe, and it is going, I think, to win an ugly victory in Ukraine. Now, your second question is, what are we likely to do as it becomes clear that Russia is going to win this war and that Ukraine is going to lose it? And you raised the possibility that the Ukrainian military or the Ukrainian government could collapse. And I think that that's true. It's a very interesting question to ask what we'll do. I mean, I think the pressure on Trump will be enormous to do something. You want to think about this. We, mainly the Biden administration, and to a lesser extent the Trump administration, have been at war with Russia since 2022. And it's very important to understand, and again, this is certainly true under the Biden administration, that we were trying to defeat Russia. We wanted to bring the Russians to their knees. We wanted to wreck their economy. We wanted to overthrow Putin. We wanted to defeat them on the battlefield inside of Ukraine. We were not playing tiddlywinks with the Russians. We were playing hardball, to put it mildly. And NATO was doing the same because, of course, we, meaning the United States, basically run NATO. So here you have the situation where the United States, its European allies, and the alliance more generally went toe to toe with the Russians. Of course, we didn't do any fighting on the battlefield, but we were involved in almost every other dimension of the war. This is why the Russians think that they've been at war with the West. So what you're positing, and I think this is what we're going to face at some point, is a situation where we lose. And do you think we're going to just throw up our hands and say, okay, we lost, we accept that? I don't think so, right? I think at least the pressure to do something will be very great. And my view is that we will not, I'm not 100% confident here, but my view is we will not do anything foolish as the war comes to an end that would precipitate possible use of nuclear weapons or us getting involved in a fight against Russia. I don't think we'll do that. Not 100% certain again, but I don't think that. But I do think, Rachel, what's going to happen here is that once we get a frozen conflict, that relations between the Russians on one side and Ukraine plus the West, to include the United States on the other side, the relations will be poisonous for as far as the eye can see. I hope I'm wrong on this, but I think the consequences of this war, if we lose, will lead to a situation where we go to great lengths to cause the Russians problems, and they go to great lengths to cause us problems. So I think when you think about what the war looks like once it ends, we're not going to move to any meaningful peace agreement.
Yeah, it's hard to see the US just backing down and kind of saying, okay, you got it, let's be friends again, right? And then at the same time, it's also hard to see Russia fully trusting the NATO alliance again, given everything that they have all been through. Now, while I have you here, the last thing that I wanted to get into is, of course, China, right? This other great power. And I thought it was really interesting to reference your book again, because in the 2014 version, you concluded with a chapter dedicated to the question of, can China rise peacefully? And you argued at the time that if China continues to grow economically, it will attempt to dominate Asia the way the US dominates the Western Hemisphere, and that the US, however, will go to enormous lengths to prevent China from achieving regional hegemony. So I'm curious, how close do you think that China is to regional hegemony, and how do you view their rise now in 2025?
Well, I've long argued, even in the first version of the book, which was 2001, that if China continued to rise in a really impressive way, which it did, that it would end up with we would end up with a security competition, an intense security competition between China and the United States that bore marked resemblance to the US Soviet competition during the Cold War. And it's very important to emphasize that almost everybody thought that I was crazy, that this would not happen, We had a policy of engagement at the time, and it was basically designed, the policy of engagement, to help China become wealthy. You want to understand that we helped China become Godzilla in East Asia. We purposely brought it into the WTO in 2001, which really juiced the Chinese economy, which was growing at an impressive rate even before it joined the WTO, but it accelerated after that. And our belief with this policy of engagement, and by the way, the policy included Democrats and Republicans. In the early 2000s, I debated Zbigniew Brzezinski on this very issue. Can China rise peacefully? And Zbig argued that it could rise peacefully. And I argued, of course, that it couldn't. And I remember saying to myself as I was up on the dais debating Zbig, this is a rather unusual situation where Zbig, who's about 5 notches to the right of me on the Dove hawkish syndrome, and he, of course, was out on the hawkish end of things, is arguing that China can rise peacefully. And I'm arguing the opposite. But that was the way it was. People just didn't think China was going to be a threat. They all sounded like panda huggers. And as much as I love going to China and I like the Chinese people, I have a very simple view of international politics, which is that you want to be really powerful because that's the best way to survive in the international system. Um, you want to remember that there's no higher authority that can come to your rescue if you get in trouble. If I attack you, Rachel, you can call 911 and the police will come. That's the higher authority. Or if I cheat you on a deal, I'm buying your house and I cheat you, you can get a lawyer and take me to court. And the state, that higher authority, will make sure that our proceedings are on the up and up. But in the international system, there's just no higher authority. Who's going to rescue the Palestinians? And the best two examples to highlight this are what the Chinese call the century of national humiliation. The Chinese were very weak from the 1840s to the 1940s. And the great powers, to include the United States and Japan, but especially the Europeans, took advantage of China and did terrible things to China. And the Chinese refer to this as the century of national humiliation. And it happened because they were weak. And the Chinese have no intention of ever being weak again. They want to be really powerful because that's the best way to survive in a system where there is no 911. But the other example that illustrates this, which will be obvious to you, has to do with NATO expansion. The question is, why were we able, we meaning the West and especially the United States, to get away with NATO expansion in the 1990s and in the early 2000s? You remember the first tranche of NATO expansion is 1999. That's when Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic come in. And then the second tranche is in 2004. And of course, we then try in 2008 to bring Georgia and Ukraine in, and that blows up in our face. But the reason we were able to get away with those first huge tranches of NATO expansion was because the Russians were too weak to prevent us from expanding NATO eastward. We just shoved NATO expansion down their throat. The Russians were adamantly opposed to NATO expansion from the get-go, as you would expect, but they couldn't do anything to prevent it. Why? Because they were so weak. The point is, you don't want to be weak. If you're Russia, you want to be really powerful. If you're China, you want to be really powerful. If you're the United States, you want to be really powerful. It's not because you're evil. It's not because you just love power. You have a type A personality, or however you want to put it. It's because having lots of power is the best way to survive in a system where there's no higher authority, and there may be some ruthless great power out there that tries to devour you, right? So anyway, I argued, starting in the first edition of Tragedy in 2001, that if China continued to grow, it would try to dominate Asia. This idea that the vast majority of foreign policy analysts in the United States had, which was that if China grew economically, it would become enmeshed in peace, love, and dope. I thought was crazy. It's just not the way the world works. Great powers, great powers are ruthless by definition. The United States is a ruthless country. Most Americans find that very hard to accept. They think that we're this knight in shining armor. We're a benign hegemon. Nobody should fear us. NATO's a defensive alliance. You know all this stuff. It's nonsense, right? The United States is a ruthless great power. You can ask the Russians. You can ask the Chinese. They've had lots of experience with us. And anyway, the end result is that if you make China more powerful, economically, it's going to translate that economic might into military might, and it's going to want to dominate Asia. Is there something wrong with this? Of course not. We dominate the Western Hemisphere. We have a Monroe Doctrine, right, which says distant great powers cannot come into our backyard. I love, as an American, the Monroe Doctrine. I'm not in favor of jettisoning the Monroe Doctrine. I don't want China putting military forces in Mexico or Canada or in Cuba or Venezuela. But what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And don't you think it's appropriate that the Chinese don't want us in their backyard? Don't you think they want to be the most powerful state in East Asia the way we want to be the most powerful state in the Western Hemisphere? And of course, the answer is yes. And so once they began to grow economically and they had the ability to translate a lot of that economic might into military might, they did it. And the end result is we have this intense security competition because we don't want them to dominate Asia. And it's perfectly understandable from our point of view. I fully understand that. I support a containment policy toward China. However, as I often say, if I were Chinese and I were in Beijing and I were Xi Jinping's national security advisor, I'd be telling him, we want to dominate Asia and we want to push the Americans out beyond the first island chain. And then we want to push them out beyond the second island chain. And then we want to give them our own version of the Monroe Doctrine and tell them they're not welcome here. So I think the structure of the system, the fact that there's no 911 and there are potentially dangerous great powers in that system gives all the great powers an incentive to maximize how much power they have, which in my world means being a regional hegemon. So this is what I think is going on. I think in a very important way, a lot of my friends who, like me, are opposed to what we did in Ukraine and think that what the Israelis are doing uh, in Gaza with regard to the Palestinians is a genocide. A lot of my friends who share those views with me think that I'm dead wrong on China, right? That I'm a hawk on China, but a dove on the other two issues. And my view on the whole China business is that you have to face up to the fact that this is just the way the world works. Right? My argument's a structural argument. It's not an argument that says you have a lot of maneuver room. My argument is that great powers are in a straitjacket. Given that there's no 911, they really have no choice here. And my argument has long been that you want to understand that because to make sure we don't end up in World War III, you want to understand what the incentives are on both sides. You want to understand what's driving the train. And I think the logic that I lay out, it doesn't explain everything about the US-China relationship, but it explains, I believe, a huge chunk of the story, right? That the structure of the system just puts these two countries in a situation where they have no choice but to compete. And the real problem here, this in a way gets back to what we were talking about regarding how the Ukraine war ends. The real problem here is that if you have an intense security competition between China and Russia, it could escalate out of control. and you could end up in a nuclear war. I mean, if you look at the situation in East Asia involving flashpoints like Taiwan, the South China Sea, the East China Sea, I actually think it's kind of scary. I mean, I can tell all sorts of not necessarily likely stories, but plausible stories. I can tell you plausible stories about how you get a hot war between the United States and China. And because these are two nuclear armed states, God knows where it will end up. So we want to avoid that. We desperately want to avoid that. And again, I think that understanding how great power politics works, understanding that the United States can be very ruthless, is important for Americans. And understanding what is motivating the Chinese is very important for Americans. And of course, the same is true on the other side of the ledger with regard to the Chinese. But anyway, in a nutshell, that's sort of my view on how international politics works when the great powers are involved and how dangerous a business it is.
Yeah, and I appreciate that because reading your book has really kind of opened my mind a little bit because I think that a lot of us that cover these topics, right, we look at China and we look at Russia and we see, oh, hey, yes, they're on the rise, they're working together, but we don't really look at the overall landscape, what that means for especially a US versus China competition and why the US is doing what it's doing when it comes to China. So I really appreciate the work that you've done, and I appreciate you taking the time to join me today to break down all of the latest and to educate us a little bit on what's going on in our world here. John Mearsheimer, an author, international relations expert, and professor at the University of Chicago, thank you so much for your time and insight.
You're more than welcome, Rachel, and thanks very much for having me on the show. I thoroughly enjoyed our conversation.
If anything in this video resonated with you, be sure to like it, share it with your friends, leave a comment, and as always, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to keep up with all of my work, make sure that you're subscribed to my page on Substack. That's rachelblevins.substack.com. That's where you'll find ad-free videos and new weekly episodes of my exclusive series for paid subscribers called Sanctioned. You can also check out Sanctioned over on my page on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Rachel Blevins. As always, thank y'all so much for all of your support, and I'll see you next time.